Alright, have you ever wondered why the newer age version of non-break units have such high multipliers in their kit compared to old ones? I mean, the obvious point to look at is power creep, as the game progresses, if newer characters aren't stronger than the old ones, why would you roll for them? But in my opinion, the actual reason is that they need to compete with Superbreak. There's a few issues I have with this mechanic, so let me just start with this. Superbreak is essentially free damage. All you have to do is build break effect, level your character up, break the enemy, and then you're good to go. There's no real worry about chasing specific pieces or leveling your talents or pretty much anything. You just do one thing, you hope your character has good toughness break efficiency, or use your on Mei because she buffs it, and that's it. It's easy. For the most part, you can ignore the break stat entirely because the supports that are used in Superbreak teams give so much of it through their talents and relic sets. There's no real build craft, and any unit can do it. There's Himiko Superbreak, where you don't have to change your relics at all from whatever set you threw on her for pure fiction. There's Superbreak Blade, getting better clears at E0 than he does with a real crit build. Hell, I've even seen Fei Zhao Superbreak get clears, though I think those ones weren't as good as their normal playstyle. In my opinion, it's honestly very similar to Dendro from Genshin. It's easy to access damage that doesn't require much of anything to actually work. In that game, the counterbalancing to Dendro started with Neuvillette, who's a crit DPS that they gave crazy strong multipliers, followed by Arlecchino and arguably Navia. Once Hoyo realized, hey, wait a minute, making a super broken non-Dendro DPS just made the game even easier than it was, the result is that now that we're in 5.x with Natlan's release, they've increased the HP of monsters in the Abyss by 50% compared to where it was in 4.8. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but what I'm seeing here is a pattern. Just like how Neuvillette released with crazy multipliers to counterbalance Dendro, you can see the start of this happening in Stara with a unit like Fei Zhao having a, let me check here. Oh, right. 64% stronger ult based on multiplier alone than Seela does. Something I think worth mentioning here is that even though Superbreak is already really strong, I don't actually think it's even reached its peak yet, which is kinda concerning. The reason I think that is because a lot of different mechanics that are introduced into Star Rail are generally testing grounds for a future character or a game mode change. The most recent example of this is the pure fiction changes that are coming in 2.7, where the grit mechanic from the recent 2.5 War Dance event is being added to it. Another example is the exo toughness bars on the current MOC, and, well, if you know, you know. When those things do get added, it's only lowering the floor to that free damage even more than it already has been. As a result of this, I have a feeling HSR is going to go down the same path that Genshin has, and the problem I have with that is that nothing is ever actually free. We might not see it a ton right now. For example, the higher multipliers I mentioned is just one example that could be coincidental, but eventually Hoyo is going to get tired of forcing break as much as they have been, and it's the players that are going to feel the consequences of that. It might be something more simple like an HP pool increase like we got with Hule in 2.5, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's a good solution, and I'll touch on that later. Before I do, another thing that I want to talk about is what I briefly mentioned earlier, buildcraft. One of the things that I like about all the different stats in games like this is that the characters can scale off different things. I want to be clear with something here. I have zero problem with a character scaling off of a specific stat like break effect or HP or effect hit rate or whatever. I think that stuff is actually a good thing because it gives variety and it makes relic farming less of a pain because eventually there's going to be someone that can use a double crit piece that rolls 20% HP or something like that. The problem with Superbreak is that it completely invalidates the break effect stat as something to scale off of for damage. Your double crit piece that rolled once into break isn't looked at as a, hey, Zoe really wants that anymore. It's instead looked at like, well, that sucks, it doesn't have as much break as my other piece, so I guess I'll never use it. And sure, it's not to say that Zoe or Boot Hill couldn't still use that double crit piece, but it's just not the same as it was before Superbreak where that stat had value as a damage modifier rather than a damage boost to a specific mechanic. I think it's actually really telling that when you look at the usage rates for Boot Hill and MOC, his Superbreak teams are used more often than hypercarry teams with something like Bronya. To go off on a bit of a side note here, I also think it's worth talking about early game. I don't know about you guys, but when I first started, it was a struggle. It felt like a challenge because the damage things were doing to us back then felt like a hell of a lot more than we could do back to them. We didn't have high attack and good crit ratios with speed tuning and all the great supports we have now, We just had our basic units like Preservation March and Dan Hang doing 50 damage per skill. One of the options we had back then was regular break, and in my opinion it was good for the same reasons that Superbreak is good now. It was accessible damage and another option that wasn't trying to scrounge together a crit set when all we had was 3 and 4 star gear. Most people just went with crit anyway because a lot of people back then rolled for Sela and had access to the Herta store cone that gave a big head start to it, but break was always there as a lesser but still valuable option. As we all progressed through the game and started getting better builds for our units, break effect became less important because your raw stats could carry your damage instead of the mechanic. Personally, I think that was really healthy for the game as it offered early game variety while players were still figuring things out, and then when Zwei was added later and scaled off break effect, it brought the stat back into relevance with a unique build style for a character. Nowadays though, they literally give you the Harmony Trailblazer when you beat Cocolia, and you're immediately then given access to Superbreak. The terrible crit builds that you have early game just don't matter anymore because now you can just build for break and get strong damage that way. Or like I mentioned earlier, you can just build the units like normal and enjoy the free damage that Superbreak offers on top of it. Most people don't have great supports earlier on in their playthrough, so having someone that gives access to a super strong mechanic like that completely changes the landscape of the early game. Personally, I don't consider that to be a good thing because it completely disincentivizes new players from learning actual game mechanics other than just break the enemy and I win, and it's way too easy to use for the damage that it offers. Considering how easy the game is otherwise, I don't think something making it even easier is something to really be that happy about. All this said, there are some mechanics in the game that they can lean into to counteract Superbreak. They could add in more enemies like Sam and the Penacony Soda Monkey who don't always have a breakable toughness bar, or they could go down the route of giving enemies shields like Argenti's Totems or the Streetlight Robot from Belobog. Both of those things stop you from breaking the enemy and therefore dealing Superbreak damage. But here's the thing, if that's the counter to Superbreak, you also have to consider how that affects non-break teams, right? Like imagine you're playing Fei Zhao and you stack up her ult, and then the enemy decides to put up a barrier just before you want to use it. You don't have to burn an entire ult on basically nothing, or save the ult and then overstack her ult counter. Another example is the Imprison mechanic. What if there's a hypercarry unit that gets released that deals more damage to imprisoned enemies, but you can't imprison the enemy you're fighting because they don't let you break their bar like when you're fighting something like Sam? The toughness bar and shield mechanics seem like simple solutions, but this ties into what I mentioned earlier in terms of consequences that the players will feel. These simple counters to Superbreak will also be super unfun mechanics to deal with for non-break teams, and also essentially deny the viability of other unit archetypes. That said, I do think there are options that they have that aren't so obtrusive to the other damage types, and here's a few of my ideas. One thing that I think they could do is change the buffs that are given by endgame content so that they're more potent towards specific archetypes, as well as they could either adjust or introduce new enemies to counteract break specifically. Personally, I like the second option a little bit less, so let's talk about that one first. An easy way that I think Superbreak's potency could be lowered is if new enemies are introduced that have detriments if you do break-related damage to them. For example, they could introduce an enemy that applies debuffs or counterattacks you when you deal break damage, kinda like the Guardian Shadow from Belobog. Or they could give certain enemies a % chance to resist breaking whenever you attack them. Those are just a couple things that I thought of, but I'm sure there's a lot of options Hoyo has if they wanted to make enemies to do that. I just hope that the ones that they might choose don't end up being super annoying to non-break teams. Like I mentioned, I actually like the idea of catering endgame buffs towards specific damage niches a bit more, so let's now talk about that. If they decided to go this route and change the buffs offered in endgame modes, I think the way to do it is by making each buff heavily incentivize one playstyle without doing anything to discourage the other types. Here's a hypothetical example. Let's say you have a unit that wants a lot of crit rate like Fei Zhao. They also happen to use a lot of skill points, so they enjoy Sparkle for that, and if you have Sparkle's Light Cone, then you can get some crit rate from that too. When you're choosing your sustain, you decide to go for Fu Zhuan for the crit rate that she provides. That hypothetical unit is going to end up with a ton of crit rate, and depending on your relic situation, might even end up over-capping on crit rate. So, what if the endgame buff for one rotation of MOC is that any crit rate you have past 100 gives you a chance to crit a second time, dealing extra damage? Now your extra crit rate isn't wasted, and you're heavily incentivized to use a crit DPS for that rotation of MOC rather than something like Superbreak. That said, just because you're incentivized to use a crit DPS for that rotation of MOC doesn't mean you're disincentivized from using something else. You can still use Superbreak or Follow Up or Dot if you want. It's just that one MOC is favored to something else apart from it. See, I honestly don't know if I have a problem with Superbreak as a concept, and I certainly don't think directly nerfing the damage niche is a good idea. It's in the game at this point, and it's going to be something that we have to deal with from now on regardless of how Hoyo decides to balance. I just think that I have a problem with it due to its ease of access and the ability to use it in pretty much any game mode without any downsides whatsoever. In the current landscape of the game, I don't even think there's anything that's bad for it, which makes it feel that much more oppressive as a damage type. Hopefully in the future, Hoyo takes a look at all this and realizes that there needs to be a leveling of the playing field. I just really hope that it's not at the cost of something like an HP increase like Genshin got, or annoying mechanics like giving a bunch of enemies shields and whatnot that affects damage niches outside of Superbreak. What do you think? Do you view Superbreak as a problem, and if so, what would you do to bring it more in line with other damage niches? Even if you're okay with where Superbreak is at the moment, feel free to let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.